You're listening to The Good Morning Show with Oliver O.T. Thomas.
One of the best. We're back, 9:06 a.m. in the morning. We want to thank all of our guests and all of our contributors, Benny Randolph and Beverly McKenna. Thank you guys so much. Trying to figure out this short-term rental, supporting or promoting private rentals. What's the real deal? We'll continue to track this and other major issues until we get to the bottom of it. That's why these conversations are important. Man, that's why conversations about how we think, how we act, and who we are. And one of the leaders of those conversations, Dr. Tammy Wilborn, welcome back to the Good Morning Show. God bless you for what you do.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you and all that you do as a professor, as a clinician, a professional with Wilborn Clinical Services. But October, National Domestic Violence Month, Dr. Wilborn. But another critical issue that's been given a month, but it's really every day, right?
It is. I mean, domestic violence is certainly a public health issue that we need to continue to raise awareness and advocacy around. It's an issue that affects millions of people, majority women. We do know that men are also abused, and so we don't want to discount those experiences as well. But by and large, it's an experience that happens mostly to women, and the forgotten victims are just children. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
You know, but Dr. Woodham, it's interesting to know how all of a sudden, like, you know, the nation, the world, especially the nation, we've discovered this issue, right, about the domestic abuse and the violence, but for decades, right, for centuries. You know, certain levels of it were not only tolerated, but it was standard operating procedure. I mean, what does that say about our society that in many cases, at certain levels of abuse, it was just the way things were done?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a cultural context of domestic violence in terms of how we think about men and women and gender roles, and how we think about who has power in relationships. And I think even particularly in the black community, when we think about church, even, for example, and the messages that we send to people around, you know, sticking it out and hanging in a relationship.
Hang in there.
Even if that relationship.
He didn't do it if he didn't love you.
Absolutely. And so there's a huge cultural component to domestic violence that I don't think we talk a lot about, but it's definitely there.
504-260-9265. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. In the studio with us is Dr. Tammy Wilborn, one of our leaders, not only in terms of this issue as a professional, as a clinician, but leading the discussions about where we go, especially now that it seems to be a national discussion. You know, Doc, I was the author of the domestic violence ordinance several years ago. And even with so many other female elected officials, when Mayor Moria did the task force, and I got on the task force, it was a story that really prompted my interest, and I saw just where we were. And it was about when police would go to a call on domestic violence, and the woman would be battered, or there would be something battered, or usually the woman would be battered or would have made the call, and they would ask him if she was okay. It was something about that just didn't seem. So she's the one there battered and bleeding, but they would approach him and say, "Hey, man, everything all right? Yeah, we're good. We're good, right?" And then I think on one occasion they left, and of course you know what happened. Is that just the way even law enforcement looked at it? The people who were supposed to protect women and children who were battered?
Yes, I think, yeah, absolutely. So I think, you know, I think historically law enforcement looked at it as this is an issue in the home. You know, you all need to kind of work that out. And
if he says it's okay,
then it's okay. And of course, there have been laws on the books where when police officers are called, they got to take somebody, right? They show up and somebody got to go. And so it's not uncommon to have those kind of responses where police officers are showing up and they're not sensitive to the victim, but they're actually in some ways sort of re-victimizing because of their responses.
Wow. I'm in the middle of family member was telling me about a case where they were involved where The police, they switched police. One team was investigating, then another team investigating. They gave them the names of witnesses. This is happening now. And the witnesses who were provided, they never even called them.
Yeah.
And they're still waiting for them to even call them.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. I'm thinking about, so one of the things I shared with you all offline is that I am an adult survivor of.
Yeah, I wanted to lead up to that, so you can say that this is not just you as a professional dealing with this. Your life history, you're a survivor of domestic violence. And tell us a little bit about that and how you've been able to manage to transition, not from what you experienced, but how to help others get through it. Because I think that's the beauty of your story, Dr. Wilborn.
Yeah, I think that, and I appreciate you kind of opening that opportunity for me to walk through that door. So, I mean, when I was growing up, my mother was married to a man who was physically and emotionally abusive. And I always like to sort of tell the story. My mother wasn't the person that kind of laid down and took a beating. She was a person who certainly fought back. But growing up, that experience was detrimental to me in terms of seeing, missing school and worried about whether or not if I was going to come home, my mother was going to be alive, and actually seeing my mother be raped by her then husband at the time, and really struggling to make sense of it because I was the oldest child, and so a lot of the police calling, a lot of the breaking up the fights, a lot of, in my experience, the worry fell on me to try to protect my mother, and actually growing up and dealing with that really affected my own relationships. It affected my own sense of safety. Even to this day, I still have what's called that startle response, and that's the response if there's like a bump in the night or a sudden kind of, I still jump even to this day, and we're talking about years later. So it has really affected my.
Has it affected your own personal relationship?
It did in the beginning. I mean, I actually had to go to counseling and try to work through some of the issues of being exposed to domestic violence and some of the thinking that goes into that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, even now I have to tell my husband, look, don't touch me randomly. He'll kind of in the morning good morning. I'm jumpy. Right. I'm still jumpy. So there's a lot of counseling and a lot of.
So if the healer, and then your life, and what you do is you help people heal.
Absolutely. From
this. So if the healer has their trouble healing, you think we finally get it now? Because it's a national discussion, but we've had national discussion. We've had the Year of the Woman before. Yes. Right? And so we're in this discussion right now, but we know that it's the testosterone that still controls the world. We see what happens in the White House. We see who's in the White House. So the discussion is one thing, but public policy is a whole nother thing, Dr. Wilborn.
Yes.
And the response is another thing. Are we just trending now, or are we in the age right now of something where we'll have some real results and some real solutions?
Well, I definitely think we're moving in a space of more awareness and more advocacy. There's definitely more laws that are changing, more policies that are changing to really help people to understand that domestic violence is a crime. It's not just a thing that's happening in people's homes, this private matter that you two deal with it, but really helping people to understand that this is a crime, that it's punishable, right? And research and policies and advocacy and these kind of experiences where you're having people come on and talk about it really raises public perception around this as an issue.
Let me ask you, especially since we've walked on that road of your own personal life, in many cases, we know children who get in the middle of battered situations wind up being battered.
Yes.
Was that your own personal experience too?
It was not.
Okay.
No, it was not. Yeah, I think that was definitely a line that my mother would have drawn. I mean, if nothing else, she made us feel safe that it was not going to happen to us.
Then let me ask you this question. We also know that women and children who've witnessed battering or seen it in the household, they're very angry responses. In many cases, they're very aggressive responses to anything that jars their memory or makes them uncomfortable. Did it affect you like that?
It definitely did. It definitely made me, we call it sort of hypervigilant. It definitely made me hypervigilant to increases in volume, increases in tone, unexpected touch, that kind of thing.
Right.
So, yeah, there was definitely a hyper-vigilance that was attached to that experience for sure.
Well, 504-260-9265. One of our most important discussions we can have, especially given what we know and this national conversation we're having right now about October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but it's not just this month. It's about how we conduct ourselves every day. I was reading a book, and you mentioned earlier about our own relationships, the cultural differences. I was reading Don Burrell's book, Brainwashed. The Burrell Agency, one of the great oldest African-American advertising agencies in the country. And he talked about how in many cases black relationships are affected and how we're conditioned. And the cultural differences about, and he questions whether we're ever really unconditional, because what we've seen, because of the stereotypes, about whether do we ever really submit, and he took it away from just overall. He said for our community. And you're saying that in many cases, domestic violence, it has affected our relationships culturally, not just socially.
Yeah, absolutely. So
expound on that, please.
Well, again, I think it goes back to understanding gender roles in relationships and this notion of power and control. Domestic violence is about power and control.
Because you can't rape your wife, right?
No, you cannot. You absolutely cannot rape your wife, right?
And people believe that.
They did, right? And again, that whole notion about women's bodies and consent and all of that,
Right.
all of that has a historical context, right? It has a historical context that goes all the way back, particularly in the black community, to slavery. I mean, I know I always have people say, well, why are we still talking about slavery? Because it's still affecting us, right?
Well, you don't get me and my complexion if there wasn't somebody taking something.
Sure. So I think understanding the historical context of rape, one, and power and control, and how laws on the books affect how people interact in their relationships is a critical piece. I want to go back to this notion of gender roles. So gender roles in terms of who does what, right? The man is the head. Women are supposed to stay at home and submit or whatever you want to say, however you want to call that.
Dr. Wilborn, whatever you want.
Whatever you
While
want
she was shaking her head, sister.
Well, it's important because, again, if we're teaching, and domestic violence is learned.
From the church to the home now.
From the church to the home, from the home to the home, we're teaching these messages about inequality and gender roles that in a lot of ways perpetuate domestic violence. If we're teaching our males, our young males, that men are in control, they're in control of women, they're in control of women's bodies, they're in control of what women do and think, then that creates a foundation for later use and abuse of power and control.
Before we get to the phones, I was talking about a year or so ago to a very prominent attorney who deals with family, domestic stuff. And they were telling me about their concern about relationships, especially amongst young African-American children and teens, how they were seeing levels of abuse actually increase, and not just with the guy hitting the girls, but with the girls being hyper-aggressive. And actually, if they're not just taking anywhere, in many cases, they're initiating the level of aggression. Have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I was one of those people.
Wow.
When I was a teenager, I know the trends are actually increasing, but I certainly recall in my young teenage dating relationships being physically violent with the person that I was dating. And in part, that was because that's what I was seeing in my home, and so that's what I thought was the way to resolve conflict.
Wow, Dr. Wilborn, man, first of all, thank you for being so revealing about your personal life, because folk would see you as Miss Perfect now, doctor, successful, professor, and I think it's extremely important that people like yourselves, who people think you have everything going for you, to know that what's possible and what you can get through, as long as you have faith and you work hard. Thank you, Dr. Wilborn. We can go to the lines right now. Line 1, Carl, you're on with Dr. Wilborn.
Good morning, Dr. Wilborn. I've been fighting a good fight for a long time, co-facilitating men's domestic violence groups, and my clarion call is for more men to get involved and more preachers and churches to deal with this, because if not, then our girls and boys are going to grow up and continue to perpetuate this problem of domestic violence.
Doc, I think Carl is agreeing with you that the discussion, there has to be a national discussion, but there has to be a deeper discussion within our own community too.
Absolutely. And Carl,
Thank you, Carl. We appreciate you, man.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing facilitating those groups.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. I think that it's a national discussion, but it's also a discussion that needs to happen within the context of the places that we work, play, and pray, right? And church is certainly one of those places.
But Doc, isn't there a level of if we're going to keep it real in the African American community, there's certain things we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain places we don't go. You know, that old uncle who stays in the back. You know, hey, look, you know, that's just the way it is. You know, we frustrated. You know, we fight, but that don't mean we don't love each other. You know, keep our business to ourselves. We bought into that for decades.
We have. That's that whole message of don't air our dirty laundry. And the danger of that is that that silence breeds, for one, it breeds shame. But that silence also breeds perpetuation of some of these same issues. And so that's why it's important to not only have these national conversations, but also to have the conversations, because when people are talking about it, they're more aware and they're more able to do something about it.
Doc, let me ask you this question. Researchers and academics and folk like yourself, even with all that we know, why are we seeing more incidents of aggressive relationships amongst teens and amongst young adults? What is the reasoning for it? And just so folk will know, it's not just happening with little Johnny and Susie on the block and from the community. Many of the professionals that I know, you know, are involved in very hostile relationships. Why the increase? What's the social? What's causing this?
Well, I think there's a lot of exposure to violence. I think, generally speaking, we live in a very violent environment, and I think children now have more access to violence than in times past. I mean, in times past, it was in your home. You might have seen it on the streets, but now you can access it on social media. Now it's violence is all on TV and everywhere, and in all of these different contexts. And so I think there's the exposure component.
Hold on a second, Doc. So you're saying the same thing in terms of relationships and how we treat each other that advocates are focusing about what happens with guns and that level of violence. You're saying what we see and what's promoted is having the same impact.
Absolutely.
You didn't stutter on that.
No, I didn't. No, absolutely not.
504-260-9265. We're about time to a moment to take a break. Then Doc, I would think, right, that there would be more outreach and more investment when we have seen folk like you've been fighting for more resources in terms of mental health and dealing with the domestic violence instead of resources being taken away.
Yeah. This whole need for resources for mental health and domestic violence prevention in particular is a critical issue that we have to prioritize.
All right. We're going to go to the lines. We're about at break time, but we're going to take this last caller before we go to break. Miss Eloise, you're on with Dr. Tammy Wilborn.
Good morning. Good morning, Doc.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Thomas.
Good morning. God bless you.
Doc, excuse me, y'all. Doc, you put out some good information this morning, something that I've been talking to my community and wherever I travel about, you know, what abuse, how abuse come about, and how we ran away from it instead of trying to explain it to people, and we lost good leadership. Because when they went to say what they were being abused with, you know, I was reading a letter from Miss Dorothy Taylor that she wrote to me. And this lady was really abused, trying to learn, trying to teach the community about the abuse that was coming from high places, the abuse that young children was receiving in their home. And I saw this lady was abused. Myself, I've been abused. You would think that I have committed an act of crime on someone, just trying to make people aware of what was really happening. You know, yesterday we had this little event at City Hall, but it's going to take more than that, Doc, to bring people to reality. People been beat down so much by the system.
Thank you.
You know, till they're afraid to admit you're still being slaves. So we got a big job to do. And I tell you, Thomas, I intend to stand no matter what I get, no matter what abuse, no matter how they try to make me homeless, because I speak from God's way. There ain't no university taught me nothing. It's what was happening around me.
Thank you.
And about taught me.
Thank you, Miss
how to speak up about the ills and the uglies in society. And like I told him yesterday, I have to do that. I got to go back out to the world and travel like I used to, from place to place, and talk about the abuse. You know, I've been to university of attorneys that coming out of the university, and really, I'm saying to them, when you get out there, your job is not easy. So please look to the people and help the people. We get nothing because everybody being manipulated by those that sit on the seat, say they're there for us.
Thank you, Miss Eloise. Appreciate it.
That's a big job, man.
Yeah, we're at the end of the segment. Thank you. The levels of the depths of what people feel and what's happened, Dr. Wilborn. When we come back, I want to talk about, if you can help our community, how do we recognize these signs? What are some of the solutions? How do we take the Wilborn way? Someone who's seen it, who's been through it, who has an exemplary life today. So we'll walk down that road to try to help our listening audience. Give us a call, man, 504-260-9265. One of the most important discussions we can have, led by one of our great leaders, one of our great clinicians that we have. She came back home not only to help herself, but to help our community. Dr. Tammy Lewis Wilborn. We'll be back after the break.
WBOK 1230 AM, the People's Station.
You're listening to the Good Morning Show with Oliver O.T. Thomas.
We're back. Dr. Tammy Wilborn. Doctor, can't wait till we have reality radio, right? All those offline, deep personal discussions, right? Oh, wow. Let me set up my Facebook Live so we can get back with Dr. Wilborn. Here we are, right back in the community on the Good Morning Show with OT and the Early Bird. Dr. Tammy Wilborn, licensed professional clinician, Wilborn Clinical Service, also a professor at the University of New Orleans. October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but it's bigger than just a month. Doc, there are a lot of statistics, there are a lot of realities, not just culturally or socially, but about Louisiana, right? And some of the data that's important, if you can set it up for the context of the rest of our discussion.
Yes, absolutely. So Louisiana actually ranks second in the nation. I actually just
every time there's something bad, right? We up there or down there.
And that rating is actually up. So we actually were third. I think I was just telling you it was third. We're actually up in terms of the ranking. So we actually rank second in the country as it relates to domestic violence. I just want to give some stats because I think stats give context. So just in terms of numbers, we have the average age of women who are abused by their partners is 37. Guns are used in 64% of those crimes.
Wow.
Again, domestic violence is a
never
crime.
thought that.
And I'm talking about specifically women who were murdered in domestic violence context. 98% of those women were actually murdered by somebody that they knew, and 60% of these women were wives. So they were either current wives or past wives or even common law wives. And there's some things that kind of affect our rankings. So in terms of resources, we actually have limited resources in the state, right? Surprise.
We've been genderized there. Mental health.
Yes.
All those things cut over the years.
Absolutely. So limited resources in terms of specifically emergency and non-emergency housing. So when women and children need to seek refuge from abuse, we don't have that many resources in the state. The other thing is there's actually more access to firearms. Again, I gave the statistic around guns being used more specifically. So more people with guns, more likely to have guns used in domestic violence situations. And then the last thing that I think is a critical piece to understand is that most oftentimes when people think about domestic violence, they think about domestic violence as an anger management issue. Domestic violence is not about anger management.
Tell us what it is, Doc.
It's about power and control. Okay, and so, the way that we look at that is that oftentimes batterers, if it were an anger management issue, we would see anger issues outside of the intimate relationship.
Doc, I'm going to inject right now because what's brought to mind is that when we've tried to make it anger management with power and control, that's pimp philosophy. Basically, when you look at it, you study, if you watch documentaries around pimping and around people who control women, that's what they do. It's more about power and control. So in many cases, what you're saying is that pimp philosophy or that pimpology actually extends to relationships with women.
Well, I can't speak on the pimp philosophy, but what I can speak on is power and control.
I watch Iceberg Slim documentary, right?
Clearly. I don't know no such a thing.
And the Mac, right?
Yeah.
Right. I'm sorry, Doc.
That's okay.
I need therapy too. What are some for folk who are listening? Oh, Doc got me, man. I'm glad we're not on television. What are some of the solutions? How do you work through this? How do you fix it? And even more importantly, if you choose to stay with a batterer, how do you help them too?
So that's that piece is a little bit complicated. So can I just give some additional pieces? Okay.
Absolutely.
So I think one way to address this issue is to kind of be aware of what to look for, right? What are the
signs?
So one thing to know is that a person who batters doesn't usually start off as a batterer. In other words, those signs, they're really nice, they're really charming.
I've heard that.
Things to look for is people who insist on being in relationships too quickly. You meet that person, all of a sudden they want, let's get married. I love you. Yeah, I want to get married, or let's be, they got that song Booed Up. Let's be booed up, right? Let's get together. Right. They can be very charming, and really it could seem to be too good to be true.
There is something to taking your time to get to know someone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Relationships that develop over time are more likely to be successful because you get to know that person, the things that you like, that you don't like.
So when you see that person a couple of years later doing things that they didn't do having interests that they didn't have, having vices that they didn't have, that actually could have been, or probably was them in the beginning.
It could have been, but you didn't pay attention to it, or it didn't,
or
that part was hidden.
They represented it.
Absolutely. Another thing to look out for is that people who batter may insist that you stop doing things that you like. They may insist that you stop having relationships with family and friends. Again, that's the power and the control piece, right? They're trying to control your ongoings. They can also be extremely jealous. Or controlling. Oftentimes we see these individuals as refusing or unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. So there's a lot of blaming going on. There's also criticism. So we see people who batter tend to criticize the appearance of or the actions of the persons that they're with. And that oftentimes the things that they say don't usually match, right? And so somebody that says that they love you, but they're physically abusive, or somebody that says that they love you, but they're criticizing you or shaming you, that doesn't typically match. Now, the thing that I want to say, OT, is that these are signs. They're not guarantees, right? So people who demonstrate these behaviors are not necessarily batterers, but they are red flags that we have seen be associated with folks who do batter.
Doc, I want to, because you're qualified, I want to have this discussion, which was rarely had, because you opened earlier you said that batterers can be men and women.
Yes.
The abused can be men and women. I'm talking to more men now, especially given what's public now with Me Too, many women coming forward. I'm talking to a lot of confused men right now. We have our own private conversations, and I'm hoping at some point it's a public conversation about the fact that how they've been labeled, or they've been accused, or even abused mentally, physically, relationally, but they're being called, they are the perpetrator, when in many cases there was a victim. Talk about that, please.
Yes.
Because to them it's real.
Oh, absolutely, it's real. And of course, I think that goes, some of that the secrecy of men who have experienced abuse is really wrapped up in a lot of what we talked about earlier. So, stereotypes and stigma of men being strong, and therefore, if you're a man, then a woman can't beat you or she can't abuse you. In reality, we know that men are abused and do experience this. The challenge with this is that because of that stigma, because of those stereotypes, it's often underreported. So we don't really have good, solid numbers about what that reality looks like for men who have these experiences. But we do know that it's actually happening, and that men, by and large, I won't say by and large, but men are trying to come forward and be more vocal about their experience. But again, what we know nationally, that the numbers show that women, by and large, are the ones that experience
people
this.
laugh and kind of belittle Terry Crews when he came forward. It was a joke. Black comedians joked about him when he talked about the Hollywood agent.
Yes.
Who actually disrespected him and harassed him.
Absolutely. I mean, and of course, again, you look at Terry Crews, somebody who's, has a muscular build, big guy, solid guy. And so there's this assumption, that because the way that he looks and because he's a black man, there's a whole stereotype around black men being aggressive and perpetrators and all this other stuff. And so we can't discount that piece as well.
Wow. This is why this conversation with Dr. Wilborn is so important. Line 1, Miss Sabrina. You're on with Dr. Tammy Wilborn.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I was just tapping in because I am a person that experienced the domestic violence, and at that age that you're talking about, real young, it started about 17 years old. My mom had passed away, and the guy I was courting, we had just had a baby, and for some reason, I think it was mainly too that my mom was like our head of household per se, so he didn't so play with her, but after she passed away, he started being real aggressive with me, like he maybe was trying to take over the role of being, that person that dictated what I did, or, how I came and how I dressed and all that. And I guess with having a baby, it kind of kept me there, and it was like hoping that we would work because now we have a child together. But he was just back and forth with saying it was going to be better. And we went to a point to where I had begun to be afraid of him. So I no longer wanted to leave because he kept threatening me to saying that he would kill me if I left. So I went through that about 10 years of my young adult life. And I ran away sometimes. I packed up through him being at work and just called myself, this time was going to be the last time. So when we get to that afraid point, we really don't know where to turn because it's like everywhere I went, I would still see him. I would go to school, he would be outside of the school and all those type things. So I just didn't know how to get out at that time till finally I begun to carry a weapon that my dad owned, and I guess built up enough courage for myself to, say, well, I'm just going to have to protect me because I'm not going to deal with this any longer. So I recently had a situation with a grandson, used my telephone, and I checked the messages that he was sending to a young lady, and he was texting that, you're going to go to bed when I say you go to bed. And it scared me so bad. I'm like, oh, no, we're not about to have, this individual come up that I knew from that situation. It just restruck that thought. So I was just wondering now, like, how to really have this conversation with my grandson that, if it's starting with that aggressiveness and his wording, what it's going to be like with his behavior, because it did literally scare me.
Thank you. First of all, Ms. Sabrina, thank you for being a survivor. Thank you for being heroic enough to share your story. We're going to let Dr. Wilborn answer first about her story, and then how can she help her grandson?
Well,
it's a good thing she caught it.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that story as well, Sabrina, because I think that's the way that we really eradicate domestic violence, is we bring these stories to light and bring these experiences to light. So I think the fact that you recognize this particular pattern emerging is insightful. And I think one of the ways that you start to address that with your grandson is to have that conversation and explore with him, have a conversation with him about where that behavior is coming from and what that behavior is about, and really trying to help him to learn better ways to communicate with his partner that doesn't involve control, right? Being able to help the grandson to see the problem in the behavior, but also teaching him more appropriate ways to communicate in ways that conveys respect and equality in relationships.
Dr. Lee, let me tell a good question, especially given Miss Tammy's story, and we've heard Miss Sabrina, we've heard this story, and then your story. 10 years, right? You know, I stayed with him 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And people are always amazed by that. How could you do that? And so are there different levels of abuse or domestic violence, and I would hate to say there's some more tolerable than others, or is it just a mindset that we get into where we're numb to it?
Well, I want to address that point. So the question, I think one of the most dangerous questions we can ask victims of abuse is, why do they stay? Because the question really isn't why do people stay. The question is, why do batterers batter? That's the question.
Thank you.
Right. I think the other part to that is Sabrina noted something that's something that we know in the trends is that oftentimes when survivors attempt to use is when the increase in risk for harm happens. So women, for example, who are likely women who leave are 7 times more likely to experience, threats and threats to loss of life when they try to leave. So it's not.
There are several women in jail now who've taken it, who've got a weapon. They're protecting themselves, and they went to jail.
Absolutely. Women and children. There's actually, I don't know the statistic on this off the top of my head, but there's also a lot of male children who are in jail because of shooting and or killing their mother's abuser. Yeah. So, again, I really do. I want to push back on the notion of asking how
could you put up with that?
Yeah. But rather, the more important question is why do men in particular batter? That's the real question. Yeah. Well, power and control. It's absolutely about power and control. And
let's dig a little deeper in that, Doc, in the time we have there now, because you open up the door for the cultural differences, right? And those dirty secrets is dirty laundry in our own community. We look at the African community right now, only 37% of our kids are growing up in a household with a male and female guardian. I told you about the conversation with the attorneys who are talking about how caustic, and how volatile young relationships amongst African Americans are. I see it and I hear it in conversations right now. Talk about us. Is there a whole nother level of angst? Is there a whole nother level of pressure within our community?
In terms of why men batter, why we have this phenomenon? Well, I think it's complicated.
See, I'm trying to get you to fix everything.
Yeah. And my challenge is I'm not a fixer, but I do try to bring healing to the community. I think there's a couple of things. I think what we know about individuals who batter is oftentimes, now this isn't always the case, right? So I want to be careful to say this, but they are themselves exposed to it in their homes, right? So oftentimes men who batter have been exposed to that in their earlier childhood experiences. The other thing that we know is that they have experiences of physical abuse themselves as children. So we see this pattern of either direct exposure to abuse, or indirect exposure to abuse as 2 of the most significant factors that contribute to why men batter.
So what are some of if you would say there are types of abuse, how would you categorize them? What are they?
Oh, there's so many different ones. So I'll try to give you some. So there's physical abuse, right?
Right, that's obvious.
That's obvious. There's also the emotional abuse. So emotional abuse looks like criticism, blaming, shaming.
You're never good enough. You don't look good enough.
Yeah.
Why can't you be like your mama?
Absolutely. There's there's also financial abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So financial abuse is using money or restricting money to assert control and power. So an example of this would be taking a paycheck, right? You know, the woman is working and the partner takes her check and restricts her use of money. There's also psychological abuse. You know, the same thing, criticizing, blaming. There's emotional abuse. There's sexual abuse. Right, so we talked earlier about rape in relationship. So those are the keys: emotional, psychological, financial, physical forms of abuse.
Doc, we only have a few minutes left, but we've talked about the increase. Louisiana is actually has a higher ranking than you thought. We've moved up since your last study. We talked about the attorneys who are seeing more and more volatile relationships, even at younger ages. How do we fix this? How do we promote some healing? Where do we go from here?
Yes, good question. And again, thank you so much for having me here. So in terms of treatment options, there's a couple of different options available. So individuals being able to, so if you're in immediate need, there are emergency and non-emergency shelters available in the city. Trauma-informed care, so individuals who are trained specifically to deal with instances of domestic violence and so that's mental health professionals working in the community, medical professionals who are working in the community that have this trauma training. Safety planning is also important as well. So for those individuals...
Hold on, wait, like hurricane preparation? Safety planning?
Safety planning. So domestic violence, so... You know, we raise the question of why do they stay. There are some people who stay for whatever reason they stay, working with those individuals to have safety plans for how to keep themselves safe even in the midst of those dangerous situations is a type of treatment protocol. Counseling and support groups for the non-offending parent, so making sure that the survivor has access to counseling services, and also counseling for the person who is a batterer, so batterer intervention programs. Again, not anger management programs, but specifically programs that are targeting batterer intervention is critical.
Wow, Doc, how can we get in touch with you? How can folk get in touch with you, either for counseling and speaking engagements or any questions they may have, not just about this, but about a lot of other issues?
Yes, so Wilborn Clinical Services, so website is www.wilbornclinicalservices.com. They can call me at 504-509-3995. Again, 504-509-3995.
You promise to come back, not just Domestic Violence Month?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Please invite me back.
Dr. Tammy, is the glass half full?
I think so.
Let's take a look at the brighter side. But I call her Miss Perfect, Dr. Wilborn. She's always looked so perfect, but she opened up her life for us here. Thank you for sharing, especially the what's important to you, but also this issue. I'm one who happens to believe that a lot of the issues and a lot of the cures and solutions for our community lie within ourselves and also within our families and in our relationships. Dr. Wilborn.
Agreed. Thank you.
This is OT and Early Bird. We did our job to keep you up. Chuck Perkins is going to make sure you're conscious. And remember, if you're looking in the mirror, right, you may have issues. It may be somebody else's fault. But if you're looking in the mirror and all you see is you might want to start dealing with it yourself. Don't wait on anybody else. Have a wonderful day. God bless you.